All right, folks, how are you doing? Welcome to the Hero's Track, creating a sense of belonging. My name is Meligha Garfield, and welcome. As far as what we're going to be doing today, I'm going to be introducing our panelists in just a second, but I wanted to kind of give you a background of what our session is today. Today, the session will focus on the importance of Affinity organizations and recruitment and retention, creating cross-campus communities, and further affirming, sorry, I don't know, and further affirming the One U vision at the University of Utah. As far as in a few housekeeping items for you all that are entering, please keep your mics muted when not talking. Turn on your cameras. I'm sorry, if possible, and use the chat to submit any questions for the panelists. And as well as the panelists, what we're going to do today is I'm going to introduce them right now. So first, we have the lovely Dr. Tiana Rogers, as the Director of Data and Director of Data and Policy and Performance Innovation at a Sorenson Impact Center and Secretary for the Black Faculty and Staff Association. Her career is centered on conducting equity-focused research married to serving as a field expert in the areas of homelessness, social impact, child welfare, maltreatment, public policy, and health disparities elimination. In addition to being a published author with teaching experience, she also consults with national and international social service organizations on evidence-based programs development and evaluation. We can just have woo for Dr. Tiana Rogers. Thank you for coming. Next, we have Dr. Annie Isabel Fukushima. Dr. Annie Isabel Fukushima is an assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Division with the School for Cultural and Social Transformation. She brings a wealth of leadership as the University of Utah's Presidential Fellow from the years 2020 to 2021, the project lead and co-principal investigator for the Gender-Based Violence Consortium, and a founder of the Women of Color Academics Collective. You can visit her at our website at anniefukushima.com. To learn about her research, teachings, leadership in the local and transnational context. Yet again, making some noise for Dr. Fukushima. And then lastly, we have Mauricio Laguan, which works as a manager at the University of Utah Office for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. He passionately works towards closing social, I'm so sorry. I wasn't transitioning fast enough. All right. He passionately works towards closing social inequities through informed policy implementation, culturally competent management, and leadership development. His current work focuses on recruitment and retention of the underrepresented faculty, staff, and leaders in health sciences education. As a graduate student in public administration, that's me as well, and gender studies, his research focuses on intersectional, critical, and feminist practices on the racial and social justice. Again, a round of applause or woo-woo for Mo. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing this so we can go into some conversation. Thank you again all for attending. I very much appreciate you all taking up the mantle to really kind of come with us today and have a heartful conversation about affinity groups and what it means to belong here at the university as a faculty and staff member. I'm going to just go right into it. Is that fine with you all? All right, so we can go in the order of whoever answers the question first, or we can go in the order of how I've kind of announced you all, whichever way you would like to do it. But the first question we have for you all today is, how were you recruited to the university? And if not recruited, what drew you to apply to the university as a person of color? And I'll put this question in the chat.
And so what's the order? Sorry.
We will start with Dr. Rogers, and we'll start from and go the order and then circle it back up.
Okay, awesome. So Thank you first, Meligha, for having us here. Really appreciative of this opportunity to share my experience with the University of Utah. And to address the question, I actually was not recruited. I came with my spouse who was recruited, and he works in the medical school and he does cancer research. And so prior to that, I actually had worked in government programs for the county, and there weren't quite alignment in looking at positions out in Utah. And so I saw a position at Sorenson Impact and saw an opportunity to be able to align my research and my practice skills, and be able to really impact communities, which I love being on the ground and hands-on. And so it ended up being a perfect fit. And so I think what drew me to apply was just the fact that I could apply both my skill sets and to be able to be in a place where I was celebrated for the contributions that I made, and not just because I was a Black person.
I like that. Good insight. What about you, Dr. Fukushima?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me, Malaysia, and everyone for joining on your busy Friday. I'm a professor. I'm a tenure track assistant professor, and oftentimes when you think about the academic market, when we talk about how we're saying you follow the jobs, we literally mean that. If you want to get a job in academia, you literally cast a net wide. The opportunities are very slim. And even more slim in certain fields. And if you stay at an institution, you oftentimes may not go at the traditional tenure track route then. So you may go into administration, or you may be doing more contingent kind of work. And so when I applied for jobs, I applied to the year I applied for the U. I applied to 70 jobs that year, and all I needed was one. And for the 3 years prior to that, I applied to about that many jobs each year, and all I needed was one job. And I ended up getting a postdoc before coming to the U, which set me up a little bit more competitively. And so then the question is, why the U? I had 3 campus visits at that time, and to me, the U was closest to family. My family's in Hawaii, and I wanted to live somewhere where I could easily fly out and get to Hawaii. And so that was the U. And the colleagues here seemed really excited to have me at the time. And I think that the enthusiasm, which I've learned is enthusiasm also for diverse colleagues. We can talk a little bit about the politics of that, but so that, I felt that, and so that's why I selected the U. I just thought quality of life, it was the best of the options that I had before me, if I was going to stay the tenure track route. And happy to talk about it more in details.
Yeah. What about you, Mo? Were you recruited? And if not, why would you apply, of all places, to University of Utah as a person of color?
It's interesting because we all kind of had a different route to the university. I have been at the university for quite some time now. And part of it is because I went to school here. And so upon graduating, and I was exposed to student affairs and working at a university campus as an undergrad. And so I wanted to stay on as full-time, I think, because I saw the value of education and the impact that it had on my life as a person of color. And so it just seemed, and as a person in general, it just seemed like such a natural connection to continue my path in higher education and working in the type of work that I do. I worked at the School of Medicine for a while as an advisor for medical students, and I saw very quickly how our institution is predominantly white. I mean, I knew it as a student, but I saw it very clearly working with medical students who the vast majority of them were white students. And there wasn't anything wrong with that, but it really highlighted the disparities to the access to graduate school, to medical education. And so, long story, I guess I'm kind of telling you a life story at this point, but I came to the university because I wanted to make a difference. And as I started working full time at the university, I started seeing just starting being more aware of like the difficulties of being here. And so it just made me to want to work more passionately towards closing some of these inequalities. And so why am I here as a person of color is because we need more folks of color here making a difference, right? So that's kind of like what drew me and why I stay.
Ooh, great responses from all of you. I kind of agree with you, Mo. A good reason why I came here as well was just like, we need people of color here in this very, very white space. And I feel like we provide just some perspectives that are not necessarily that are here already, but we can even bring even more expertise and just experiences. So I very much enjoy that. So the next question, is a little my own personal experience as far as an onboarding here at the university is that it is not very apparent. Onboarding kind of is bad here, and this is what I've heard across the university is that onboarding needs a lot of work. And so my question to you all is, what was your onboarding experience here at the university? What was it like? And I'll start with you.
I think I had maybe an unfair advantage since I had been here for so long as a student. I knew the campus, I knew kind of like the ins and outs and some systems, although I learned a lot because it's different being a student to working here full time. But I would say if I could speak to onboarding is that I don't know that there's an intentionality in onboarding outside of just like, hey, fill out your paperwork, sign up for benefits, like, and that's what I think of when I think of onboarding. And so some of the things that I think about in light of the topic for today is how do we create community for the folks that are coming here? And that's something that I had years before I felt like I've seen a community building here. And it wasn't until I started working in equity and diversity work where I was with more folks of color and folks from queer backgrounds and all the other underrepresented groups that I was like, oh my gosh, there is a community here. And so it was unfortunate that I had to wait that long in my onboarding, I guess, to find that.
What about you, Dr. Fukushima?
Yeah, so for new faculty that are earlier in their career, there's a new faculty orientation. And that's where I met some of my friends. We happen to be sitting next to each other, me and my colleague. And anyways, how that goes. You start to build affinities when your neighbor and you are joking about what's going on. And I think the thing that was apparent, I remember I arrived, it was an 8 a.m. new faculty orientation and there was no coffee. And I was like, how does anyone go to a faculty meeting without coffee? Welcome to Utah. I learned that there's not coffee everywhere. And so that was kind of my onboarding, but I did have a new faculty orientation, which is actually more than some colleagues get. So if you come later in your career as like an associate professor or even advanced, you don't actually always get invited to the new faculty orientation, which I'm not sure why. So for myself, that was how I was onboarded, was a new faculty orientation. And then also joining faculty at our monthly or semesterly meetings, depending on what that is. So, yeah.
Interesting. I did not know that, as far as not everyone is invited to those beginning conversations. What about you, Dr. Rogers? What was your onboarding experience like here at the university?
I I'm learning. I'm learning that my experience has been an outlier. But it's actually encouraging because I think, oftentimes we talk about things that don't go well, and I don't think we're always as good as highlighting when things do go well. And so for me, my onboarding was very non-traditional. And I think because I am at Sorenson and we are kind of like a we kind of are our own little entity outside of the business school. And it's a small organization. There's only like maybe, I think we have like 27 staff there. And so I'm not, working with academics in the traditional sense. And so my first day was like me meeting with my boss and his boss. They took me out to lunch and we just like kind of talked about like what my reservations were about being in a place where I was the only Black person in the entire staff, and like just having a moment of truth of like, I came from Minneapolis. I worked at the most diverse county in the state of Minnesota. And this is a huge change for me. And just being really honest. And it was very well received. And they were just like, let us know what we can do to better support you, to make you, feel more supported in this space. And I have to say, 2.5 years in, I've never, not once, felt like the only Black person at my center. Never. And so I think that how you go in really matters. And then also, being greeted by, I don't know where I was, but somebody on campus saw me and they were like, oh my gosh, like we have this Black, faculty and staff group. You should come, blah, blah, blah. I'll send you an email. And so I was like, sure, and I got an email within the first week and I forwarded the email to the CFO at the center and they paid my dues for me to be a member. And so like, I felt like mine was like pretty smooth and very, it was just very reassuring, to know like, okay, there's not a lot of us here, but there are some, and there is a sense of community. And even outside of the affinity group, where I work, it feels like a community. And so I think that that's really important to recognize that we can still create communities of inclusion and places where people belong, even outside of the affinity groups.
Now that is that's very interesting, because that leads right into our next question. And that is, how were you introduced to affinity groups here at the university? And do you feel there was an affinity group that met most of your needs? And so I'm kind of turning it right back around with Dr. Rogers,
Okay.
to kind of elaborate a little bit more on what you just stated.
Yeah. So again, I was kind of recruited because somebody saw me on campus and they were like, this is a new face, we've never seen her before. And I think it was, nice to, like, my first meeting, I remember feeling like, okay, like this is not something, it didn't feel like, because this is a Black faculty and staff group, I have to be a part of this. It was more or less like, hey, this is something that we're doing. And if you want to be a part of it, we would love to have you be a part of it, And so that felt more authentic and aligned with kind of my values. And I feel like, just having been, now I'm the secretary of the Black faculty and staff, and so holding a board position in the group, I've been able to see that while I haven't had to use the BFSA organization for advocacy in my position, I recognize that that is a huge role that they play in just helping people navigate academia. And, we have things like certain people are even hesitant to be in officer positions because they're on tenure track and they're afraid that it may, be looked poorly upon. And so for me, not being on tenure track, I have, I think, more freedom than a lot of others may feel that they have. So for me, I think, glean the most just from having a community of people that can like tell me where I can go eat, tell me where I can get my hair done, tell me where I can, the things that the things that help me feel like I belong here, you know, like, and that cannot be understated. And just having, you know, a place, like even during COVID, like when we have our meetings, just having that synergy of knowing that like you're not alone, like there are other people that identify with your struggle and that they see you and they're celebrating you and they're happy that you're here. So I think that, you know, it's hugely valuable for me and I'm really appreciative to be a part of it.
Yeah, and you would kind of speak on that community really helps you just navigate the university, but also just makes you feel welcome, especially in a year we had earthquakes, we had COVID, we got people getting kicked out of office, we got all types all types of things. But it's just like, yeah, that sense of home, at least a picture of it or a little bit of it. Yes, it's great. What about you, Dr. Fukushima? What was your experience with affinity groups? And
Yeah, when I started in 2015, there wasn't an affinity group for me. And so we definitely, I think the article had just come out. So I'm Korean Mexican, I'm an Asian Latina. And I remember seeing in the media, like the coverage of the recent, 8 going up for tenure, right? That was huge, the 8 Latinas. And so it was kind of this interesting moment to be entering into the U, where there was also then that organized student protest, right? That then led to the 13 steps and some of the meaningful, some meaningful change at the U. But at the time, I remember when I first started, I would have, and so I shared an Inside Higher Ed article about how the further up you go in academia, the less diverse it gets, right? And I think that what we know is that there's definitely more diversity in academic institutions, but the question becomes where. Are they more likely to be in frontline staff roles? Are they more likely to be in more contingent academic roles? Do we see them going up into the highest ranks of academia? Not so much, and that's not unique to the University of Utah. It is endemic to higher ed, right? And so I would have graduate students, women of color, of all communities, regularly crying in my office. Many of them were on like a long-term forever plan, like they were just not graduating, and they weren't getting the mentorship that they needed. And so I knew that when I was at Rutgers prior, I had been part of a Women of Color Academics collective like organization where we would do socials and we would have professional mentoring activities. And so there was a model that I had experienced of creating community while I was a postdoc. And so I knew that we could facilitate something. And at first it started with my, when I was first hired, I was jointly appointed in social work. And it started off as a social work group, and then it eventually grew out. And so now it's much bigger. So that's kind of how the affinity group came into existence of Women of Color Academics. We are what we see women as broadly defined. We recognize that gender is fluid. And so and then when we also recognize that people come to the term women of color in different ways. We have white Latinas in the group, for example, or whiteness impacts all of our communities just as much as the spectrum of how Blackness and brownness and the list goes on impacts us too. And so we're quite a diverse group. And so we do socials to workshops, and pandemic has definitely impacted how we connect because much of it was surrounding food. So I feel like I had really good catering, and so I'm really bummed out where I'm like, oh, that's it's really hard to cater to everybody's homes. So we're in a very different moment. So I am welcoming the time when we can safely eat together, because that will be the thing that we will be eating together for sure, even if it's safely. And so, but for now, while we're in a pandemic, we are safely connecting by Zoom.
yes, I think that's the one thing I missed this year with others, is just really sharing a meal. It's like, man, I really miss that. But yes, definitely, I agree with you wholeheartedly. What about you, Mo? How were you introduced to affinity groups? And if not, like, what was your experience as far as in here on the university?
Yeah, I don't. So this is the thing. I don't. There hasn't been for an affinity group that I felt like has like kind of aligned with me. I think if I think about the groups that I'm a part of on campus, like there are definitely working groups, like I mentioned earlier, like the EDI group, the umbrella that many of us fall under, has become like a group that I rely on and that I go to, and there are individuals in that group, but there isn't like a structured organization. And so part of the work that I'm doing, so I'm on a member of staff council here at the University of Utah, and there's a need, right, for affinity groups. And so I was kind of given a platform in where I could start sharing some of that voice. And so I started moving some pieces together, and I was like, how do we replicate what's happening with the BFSA? Dr. Rogers spoke really well about it. And how do we provide that model largely to other racial and ethnic affinity groups that are on campus? And so that's kind of been my role so far in affinity groups, is there hasn't been one. So I'm like, how do we start them? So I started working with the staff council, working with the BFSA, and kind of sent out a survey and to friends and colleagues. And I was like, hey, who wants to get together and like start something? And as that's been happening, and I'm happy to share the little survey monkey that I shared with this group, as that started happening, my boss, who's the Associate Vice President for Health, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and then Dr. Via Rial, the Vice President for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, saw, and I think even before I started bringing, this wasn't like my unique idea, but I think as the support that the institution needs to provide for faculty and staff of color. And so kind of got their approval. We're currently working with a committee on a policy proposal to support the creation of and the sustaining of faculty and staff associations as an institution. In my research, I'm trying to understand what the role of human resources and academic affairs is in providing those groups. And we spoke about onboarding earlier, and like what is the role of affinity groups in onboarding and creating that community, right? Like I love hearing Dr. Rogers' experience being on campus and someone saying like, hey, you're a new face, come join us if you want. How do we systemize that kind of interaction, right? Like how do we, when someone applies to the job and gets an offer, there is an immediate connection to an affinity group or to a place where they can go and learn about affinity groups. And so that's kind of been, because the lack of affinity group for me personally, like there are groups of Latinos on campus and of Hispanic and Latinx people on campus, but no official group, right? And so I'm like, we need one. Like, where are my Latinx folks? Where are my Hispanics, my Latinos, my Chicanos? Like, and so in the process of being built, and for others too, right? There is a strong Asian community, a strong Pacific Islander community. There's a strong queer and trans community. There are different abilities. There are veterans on this campus. And we do a phenomenal job of providing those resources for students. We have the LGBT Resource Center, the Black Cultural Center, we have CESA, we have the Dream Center. So how do we do that for our faculty and for our staff?
Ooh, that you really hit the nail on the ball. Really understanding, like, yeah, those services are provided for students, but how do we retain faculty and staff here at the university? We need to attack that issue just like we're attacking it with students. But yeah, I agree with it wholeheartedly. All right, my next question in this particular series of questions is, what do you feel are some individual and collective concerns of faculty and staff of color and other marginalized groups here at the university? And I will start with you, Mo.
I think I alluded, to some of what I think, but at least from my experience as a staff member on campus, is really just being connected to a larger community. And then also feeling like my voice is being heard, right? The collective voice. I think there are places on campus that want to hear the voices, but I know that there are places on campus that don't, and where people feel isolated, where people feel like they're the only one, or that, they're experiencing microaggressions and experiencing discrimination. So how do we provide both a support group to like have fun, gather, be around food and socialize, but also advocate bring a voice, whether it's to HR, whether it's to academic affairs, whether it's to a vice president, whomever the power structure is the, wherever the power structure is the right place. How do we provide that for folks? And so I feel empowered to do something around that. I see Francie, thank you for bringing up the American Indian Resource Center. Another great place that's there for students, and I know lots of staff and faculty go there. And but again, like, it's student focused, right? How do we connect our American Indian faculty and staff on campus together to advocate for each other and for your needs?
Mm. What about you, Dr. Fukushima?
Yeah. So what do you feel are some of the individual and collective concerns, for faculty and staff? And when I created WOCA, the goal was to create horizontal and vertical mentoring, because the idea was that I can't mentor all these students. And that actually one of the things that I had learned from when I was in graduate school is that my best mentors were also my colleagues. And so how do we foster so then there is different directions of mentoring going on? And that was actually something, that's what WOCA tries to do. So we do different kinds of activities where we bring together folks across their, academic experience. I think when you see people in leadership positions, or when you see people that look like you in different ranks, you can imagine yourself entering into those different positions as well. And because it's hard, like when I worked with mentoring Pacific Islander students, and at the time there weren't many Pacific Islander faculty at the U, we increased that. But that's a lot of work for them to begin to imagine themselves entering into something where they literally don't see anybody else that looks like them entering into it. And so I think some of the concerns, there was an article that I was reading by Caroline Sotelo Viernes Turner, and she was talking about how and I'm speaking of women of color in particular, because that's my embodied experience, right? And so she talks about how faculty and women of color experience being more visible and on display, right? Feeling more pressure to conform. And this is stuff that was coming up during the earlier workshop, presentation, not workshop, but the panel presentations, becoming socially invisible, right? Finding it harder to gain credibility, being more isolated, being more likely to be excluded from informal peer networks, or having limited access to power and resources, having fewer opportunities to be sponsored, misperceptions, being stereotyped, and facing more personal stress. And so there's a lot of things that go into when you are, a person of color, or a person who is, at the margins of an academic institution. And so there's a lot of need, I think. And so I think that's what makes it really hard in that sense. And so one organization or one group cannot fulfill everyone's needs. And so I do think that what some of my best mentoring was learning that I actually needed to surround myself by many mentors. I can't put it all on one boat, like one person. And so I think that whatever can happen next needs to foster that. We need many mechanisms of support in a range of ways. And so it can be these affinity groups. These groups are really important, but then it also might mean having more malleability, so then we get the support that we need in other spaces and places too.
Mm. Like that. Okay. What about you, Dr. Rogers? What do you feel are some concerns of faculty and staff of color and other marginalized groups here at the university?
I guess I would really echo a lot of the sentiments that were already mentioned by Mo and Dr. Fukushima. I think from what I've heard, I will say, is on an individual level, I think that it is important to, the concern is around the mentorship too. And actually, even for myself, being at Sorenson, every time I have a review, the conversation is who can mentor me in this space? No one else looks like me that is in social impact, that could speak to kind of where I'm even trying to go. And so I've had so many conversations about that more recently in the last few weeks because I got promoted. And so it came up again, you know, thank you. Yeah, it came up again of like, you know, they're like, we see you, you know, being promoted again fairly soon. But even in my head, I'm like, okay, you will be what you see. And if I don't see even women in social impact space, you know, like who is going to help me navigate this? And so I do think that that is something that has been a concern, which is also why I am a mentor for the African American Doctoral Scholars Program, because I recognize just how important mentorship is. And I would say as a collective concern, a lot of the things that our group kind of discusses is around many of the issues already mentioned around, you know, who do we take these issues to when people are having a hard time in their workspace? How do we address microaggressions, macroaggressions? The microaggressions are really the worst. You know, like, and how do we account also for the emotional labor that goes into the work that we're doing, being the onlys in some of the spaces that we occupy? And so I think that there's a lot of conversation around, you know, how do we account for those things? And in my specific situation, I've just had to say, I don't want to consult on DE and I stuff. That's not what I do. That's not my expertise. You know, I don't want to consult on that project for that, you know? So I think, you know, there's a collective concern around, are you able to be that assertive without it being, you're being aggressive or you're being, you know, hostile or you're just angry, you know? So I think that there's a lot of concern around that too, like just how to negotiate in those situations, how to assert yourself and demand what you're worth. I think that there's a lot of conversation that happens in our group about that.
Great perspectives from all of you that presented. I think for me personally, the biggest concern that I have, and I've talked with several others, is that, and I believe Dr. Fukushima, we had this on another panel, that problem of being an imposter and feeling like an imposter here at the university. And I think that plays a lot as far as in just people of color, where like, yeah, we don't see ourselves, and then we're like, well, okay, should I even be in this type of position? Because I'm just like, yeah, maybe I don't want to do D&I work. Am I really, you know, you have this imposter syndrome on like, am I really the person to really be doing this? And so it often questions your ability, your confidence, and then also questions, hey, well, should I be assertive or not? Because that bigger problem of being just feeling like an imposter. And so it leads into my next question. Through faculty and staff affinity groups or anything really pertaining to faculty and staff, what are some solutions these types of groups provide for recruitment and retention of our faculty and staff of color? We'll start with Mo. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm happy to start. I think you mentioned this in my bio, like my job is recruitment and retention, right? Like that's what I do. And so I'm by no means like a seasoned expert. I'm a newly tinted expert is what I like to call me. But I think when I speak to departments and to groups who are hiring, I think one of the things that I talk about is showing community at first, right? Like I think what a lot of departments have a hard time with is they're very homogenous groups, right? Like predominantly white groups. And so like, how do we diversify our faculty group or our staff group or our like, you know, whatever group? And I think it's connecting to larger communities, what I say, right? Like I've just in the last 2-3 months that I've started consulting with the Black Faculty Staff Association, I've mentioned the Black and Faculty Staff Association to recruitment and search committees. And they're like, wait, there is one on campus. And I'm like, yeah, there is. And like, you need to connect to them in the recruitment process, not just when you've hired someone and they're here, but like, how do you tap into that potential? Because you don't have any Black folk in your group, right? And so how do you connect to the greater group of Black folk on campus? And so that's what I say. I think that community really does. And if you do have folks of color in your community, make them a part of search committees. You know, like if when we're going back to dinners, like make them part of the dinner conversations, the socializing, like that helps a ton in the recruitment process. And then transparency and just like being honest, right? Like don't blindside a person of color and saying like you're gonna have X, Y, and Z here, or there's gonna, you know, like you're not gonna be the only, like be honest in that process. And so anyway, I could go on and on, but I think that, and then in the retaining process, which I think is where we should focus like 80% of our effort, is in keeping the folks here. Like we've already mentioned, it creates community, it creates advocacy groups. I think it, when I think of affinity groups, I think of that shared responsibility and the collective power, because Dr. Rogers is right. Not every person of color in every department is going to be the chair of your EDI committee. Like that's an unfair assumption from any department, any school to put that onus on people of color, on women of color. And so groups like affinity groups, people who have identified as wanting to be part of that, like those are the people you can go to, and those groups can serve so much better to not just people of color, but our institution as a whole.
I agree.
Yeah.
Snap to that one. Yes. Dr. Fukushima, what are your thoughts on that? What are solutions?
Yeah. Sorry, Mo, I missed like, I think a little bit of yours. I got kicked out. My internet, you know, this is what happens when you're on your home internet. So apologies. So if I say anything that sounds repetitive, apologies in advance. I think that one of the things with the affinity groups is that they do create a sense of community, and I think that there's something powerful when I organize a WOCA group and then you sign in and you see all the photos, or people signing in with their Zoom, and like you see a bunch of brown, Black, range of color faces, people who just look more like the community that I grew up in, and so I think that it's really wonderful to be able to just enter into a space and not feel like you're immediately entering into it and you're like, I'm the only person at the table, which happens a lot in a range of spaces. And so for me, that's been really meaningful to connect that way. But I do think that there is, and I was hearing Mo, you talk about retention. Since I've been here, I've seen so many women of color leave the U every year. And we do have a retention challenge. And I think part of it is because on the one hand, are the efforts that the university does, but we also have the context of our culture. We live in a context of a culture that is incredibly white, that is incredibly dominant by a particular religion. And if you don't belong to that religion, you feel it. And there's all other kinds of things that happen because of those value systems. And I'm not saying that so anyway, so it makes it very challenging, I think. And so we lose folks every year. And I think that to think about how do we retain folks means that we also have to imagine that the university isn't the only place that we consider our home and connection. They have to think about what are the other ways that they support and facilitate a sense of community and belonging beyond the academic institution. So it's not just when I need community services because I'm homeless or because something's gone awry, but because I want community. And I think that's the PI initiative is one we might be able to learn a little bit from that, how they've been trying to organize in community. And not all of us have groups for our communities, or maybe, we're bordered, I'm an Asian Latina, so I'm in multiple communities. And so, so I think that there's still ongoing connections with the community beyond the community of the academic institution that needs to also be fostered.
Gotcha. Beautiful words. Dr. Rogers, what are your thoughts? What are some solutions to retaining and recruiting faculty and staff of color here?
I don't have a lot beyond what has already been said. But I do think I can speak to what was helpful for myself and my husband when we came. I think it was like maybe our second or third site visit. The medical school had set up lunches or dinners with other Black or BIPOC staff and faculty on campus. And some of them, you know, didn't share great updates. But but I think you know, having a well-rounded kind of perspective and hearing the good, the bad, and the ugly, you know, about what exists, it allowed us to make a better informed decision about our choice to come here.
Mhm.
And so I think that, as Mo had mentioned, you know, being transparent about the struggles, because there are some people who will be like, that's fine. You know, for my husband, he grew up in rural North Carolina, so he's not unaccustomed to being the only Black person. So he was kind of like, this is not really a big deal. Whereas for me, that was not the case. And I was like, I definitely do not want to go to Utah. Like, you know, there is nothing that sounds appealing about moving to Utah. So I think, you know, having those folks that were a part of BFSA meet with us before we even came was super helpful. They didn't paint this rosy picture that was not rooted in the truth. And everything that they said, of course, some of it was context and relative to what schools and departments that people were in, but nothing that was said, everything kind of rang true once we got here. But even once we got here, we were like, this is manageable, you know, like we can deal with this. This is nothing has, and I can honestly say in 2.5 years, nothing has majorly happened with either of us in our positions that's made us think that this wasn't the good choice. So I think that, again, community is so important. But beyond academia, having community outside of the university matters. And for us, we're people of faith. So we were asking people, you know, what are some churches that are not LDS churches, like that we can go to? And people were very open to sharing, you know, try this, try that, try this. And so we, you know, had the freedom to try to find community on our own also, which I think has really helped us, because no matter where you are, you have to get connected. So I think, you know, if we could do more of that, and have some things that are not just centered around the University of Utah, because once we leave camp, you know, I talk about this all the time, once we leave campus, I'm not Dr. Rogers. Like, I'm just a Black woman in a predominantly white patriarchal community. And that has a multitude of meanings, and it creates a multitude of barriers just in my day-to-day life. So we have to account for those things.
And I'm hearing a unified kind of message, is like investment in the broader community outside of the university will retain faculty and staff if we set up things that allow us to have community, because yes, we are not just our jobs. And I think a lot of people kind of get that, like, oh, well, we'll just get you here and you start working at the university, you know, it's your work that will keep you here. No, we need community. We need to feel like we're a part of the place in which we live, but also work. And so I agree wholeheartedly with each and every one of you that have stated that unified message, like investment into the community outside. Because yes, I mean, also change some of them liquor laws, you know. I would like a stronger drink sometime, but but we won't say. But yes, definitely a good message. All right, so with that, we're coming up on a time. I would like to see if anyone has any questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat. We'll open it up for the last 5 minutes here. Any questions, or if you would like to just unmute your mic and ask a question, feel free to do so. But does anyone have any questions?
While people are thinking, can I say something?
Yeah,
And
go ahead.
maybe not radical, but an invitation to anyone in the group, like not just the panelists, but in this meeting, if you have some sort of managerial role in your organization, and even if you don't, even if you are reporting directly to a manager or however it is in the organization, I would invite you to find a way to either connect your employees to an affinity group or to find a way to create affinity groups in your own areas. Like, I think we talk about like WOCA and BFSA and how they're these big umbrellas, and they serve a purpose in the organization, but that doesn't replace the need for community and gathering locally. And so whatever that looks like, I would encourage folks, whether it's a BIPOC group, a women's group, a queer group, like to really get folks together, because like that's what starts community, and that's what starts belonging and inclusion. And it, yeah, anyway, that was just an invitation to the larger audience. If you don't have any
Yeah,
questions.
and I guess one of the things I just want to say is at the moment we start creating criteria of inclusion, we also unintentionally exclude. And so then I think that one of the things is that when you think of these WOCA, BFSA and all these groups that may emerge in the future, is be generous with thinking that they're fulfilling a particular need. They cannot fulfill a need for everyone. But they do fulfill particular important needs for who can join them, right? And if you don't see yourself in it, then as Mo, you were saying, there isn't a group for you, then there's a group somewhere though, right? So what can that group be? And I've met so many cool colleagues at the U. I think that is what keeps me at the U, is like I have really good friends. And so it's just like, yeah, who is that group then that can be a group for you? Yeah, there's a ton of smaller cluster things that are happening that maybe don't have as much visibility. And so if you are organizing something that doesn't have as much visibility as like WOCA and BFSA, tell us about it, because we want to promote, support it as well.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I would add on to that as well, as far as in creating these future affinity groups in the future, it does not also have to be based around gender, sex, ethnicity, or race. Like, I very much would love to be in a group where we talk about Marvel, or we talk about, video games, or, movies. I'm a huge movie fan. Like, I would love to go to the movies with a group of people all the time, with various faculty and staff that are also into movies. So, just I think in the larger picture, for us to retain anybody here at the university, we need groups. Oh, yeah. Oh, Star Wars. I'm a Star Trek fan. I'm not really Star Wars, but I understand. But yeah, just kind of creating those groups that can really fulfill us and help, again, build that sense of community. Because yes, I think in the broader picture, we're all not a monolith, especially in the BIPOC group. And then on top of that, as far as in pertaining to my identity, not all Black people are the same. Not all Asian people are the same. Not all Latinx people are the same. And so even in those type of groups, yes, we need those larger support systems, but then there's individual traits that we all inhabit as well. And we need those support systems as well as with that. But yeah.
I love that you bring the intersections too, right? Because there are queer Latinx folk, there are queer Black folk, there are, transgender women. There's just like the intersections, like we miss them so much because we think so linearly, and our identities are these linear things, when in reality, they're these complex webs of so many things, both social constructs and social identities, but passions and interests and values and all of this stuff. So yeah, 100%. I love that. Thank you for bringing that up, Meligha.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any questions. I would say my last question I have for you all, then, as far as in that, is just what would you like to take from here today? Like, where do we go from here? What are your thoughts? And if it is just a word or a sentence or two, like what do we take from here as far as in creating a sense of belong here at the university? And anyone can start, or you don't have to answer it if you don't want to answer, but yeah.
I can start. I think I really like what you said, Meligha, about the intersectionality of things. And I think I really would encourage people to recognize that we are much more alike than we are different, and being able to celebrate those things, and not always focus on how we are so different. Like there are, yes, as Dr. Fukushima noted, there are groups, that are there for their specific purpose and they serve a specific group. But I think when we start to silo ourselves so much and we focus on ourselves, I think that we lose a lot of things. We lose a lot of opportunity to connect and to learn from one another. So I think that going forward, acknowledging those things, that there is a place for those things, but being open, I think being more open, because we've had non-BIPOC folks asked to come to BFSA meetings, and they have, and we've had wonderful conversations, and so I think that just creating space, for connection is something that I think we have to remember that is valuable, because especially during these COVID times, we can't take that for granted once we're back together, so that's what I would say.
Exactly. Thank you. Any other last minute words?
I'll just say that I think that one of the things that in the years that I've been in the academe, is that, or decades, I guess now, is that, I've witnessed a lot of colleagues, faculty, staff, students experience a lot of traumatic events, right? And maybe they're multiple, they're macro, they're micro. And I think that we do have a lot of colleagues who are deeply wounded by these spaces. And so there is a need for a lot of healing work to happen. And I think that so one of the things is that as you continue to do the work of trying to address, racism, in your workspace and place, that's today's kind of theme, is that there's a lot of wound that people carry with them. And so then how do we move forward, witnessing, acknowledging, seeing them, and also know that people have experienced also great joy in academic institutions, and that we can hold the two together. I can be wounded by it, and I can also experience great joy in these spaces. And so it's not either or. And so that would be my leaving remarks, is that if you, again, are in leadership position or a mentoring position, do the work of also supporting and recognizing when somebody does need support, though, or needs space, or just needs maybe some care and connection that in this time, I think sometimes we can be less generous because maybe people are feeling really tired, or all the world, Meligha, your opening reminded us of the world that we're living in, right? And so, yeah. So be generous with yourself and everyone else too.
Yes. And I would also say, protect your magic, protect your magic. All right. With that, I just would like a couple words before we end it right here at the top of the hour. And that is, thank you all for attending our session on our Harris track of understanding sense of belonging for faculty and staff of color at the university. We invite you to register for our Friday forums on January 23rd, where we'll be talking about a call for racial healing, Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.